At the start of the 20th century, the Royal Navy had decided to give their expanding destroyer flotillas a little bit more backbone, and so they built a range of small vessels that they designated as scout cruisers. These ships had two primary duties: to lead destroyer flotillas into combat, and to defend the fleet against attack by enemy destroyers. Given that the largest and most modern destroyers of the time might sport 1 or 2 3-inch guns or similar, and a handful of smaller weapons, the large battery of 10 such guns, plus almost as many 47mm guns in the first few classes, seemed to offer overwhelming firepower, and this would be upgraded further to a 4-inch main battery as more ships were built. However, they were all ordered to a premise that turned out to only be valid for a few years in the early 1900s, when the Royal Navy's older and smaller torpedo boat destroyer flotillas, while notionally capable of 30 knots or close to, depending on the class, were fairly short range and, due to their small size, much slower than this in anything but a flat calm, and the latest, somewhat larger destroyers were capable of around 25 to 27 knots. So a slightly larger ship capable of sustaining 25 knots in almost all weathers made sense. Unfortunately, destroyer speeds continued to increase, and helped by their rapid build time, by the end of the 1900s, a number of classes of larger destroyer were capable of 32 to 33 knots, and the average speed of all new destroyer flotillas was reaching at least the upper end of the 20s. Some classes, built overseas, were faster still, and so it was evident that the current crop of 25-knot ships would, despite being less than a decade old at most, be incapable of fulfilling either of their assigned roles, since they would be a drag on their own flotillas, and enemy flotillas would be able to bypass them. Meanwhile, for more general fleet duties, the Royal Navy had recently introduced the Town class, a variety of sub-designs in the new light armoured cruiser category, essentially a ship that was much like an old protected cruiser in terms of size and armament, but with a thin armour belt to protect against similar size opposition. And so, in an effort to save the scout cruiser type or concept, a new design, the Arethusa class, was drawn up. This in many ways resembled a slightly scaled down Town class, but built for speed. To keep up with the new destroyers, it was decided to switch from coal and oil mixed fuel to oil fuel only, and from vertical triple expansion engines to turbine propulsion, although since geared turbines at that scale weren't yet a thing, the 4 shafts needed 2 kinds of turbines, a pair for cruising and a higher speed pair which would be engaged when maximum velocity was needed. The boilers provided 40,000 shaft horsepower for a design speed of 30 knots, although, as it turned out, 29.5 was the most they'd ever achieve in service, largely due to a recognised need for new propellers designed for these higher RPMs, but whose delivery was curtailed by the outbreak of war. Armour consisted of a belt with a 3-inch maximum thickness, trending down to 1 inch, with a 1-inch thick deck that provided a degree of splinter and shell protection. Armament was hotly debated, with 8, 10 or 12 4-inch guns proposed for most of the design process, as these fast-firing weapons would be ideal for taking out destroyers, especially as the larger hull, which would displace around 3,500 tons at normal displacement, would allow for a more stable firing platform and the use of a longer barrel, higher velocity gun than the type installed on destroyers. Eventually, the 12-gun design was accepted, but at the very last minute this was changed to 8 single 4-inch and a pair of single 6-inch, the latter placed one fore and one aft, and the 4-inch down either side. The heavier guns were implemented to help deal with potential enemy equivalent ships, or to give them a firepower advantage over most German protected cruisers generally, which tended to be armed exclusively with 4.1-inch guns at this time. This was changed again when the torpedo armament was upgraded to 4 21-inch torpedo tubes in a pair of twin launchers, which caused the dropping of the 4-inch armament down to 6 guns, 3 per side. 8 ships would be ordered, laid down in 1912 and 1913, with each taking about 2 years to go from keel laying to commissioning. Due to their design role, they were thrust into very active service in World War I. Arethusa herself became the flagship of the Harwich Force, where she took part in several battles and raids before hitting a mine and subsequently going aground in early 1916, becoming the only member of the class to be lost in action. 4 of her sisters were also initially assigned to the Harwich Force, with the other 3 initially going to the Grand Fleet, although Phaeton would wind up at Gallipoli at one point. 4 of the class would take part in the Battle of Jutland, but as the war went on, it was clear that the class was limited. Small additions, like a single 3-pounder anti-aircraft gun, pushed their stability reserves right to the limit, and they sat in an awkward space where they were a little too small to be full fleet cruisers, but a little bit too large to really be destroyer leaders. With a surfeit of the larger and more powerful C-class cruisers, plus some of the less worn-out Town class, and also with the destroyers of the late 1910s having as much of a speed advantage over the Arethusas as the early 1910s destroyers had possessed over the older scout cruisers, the Arethusas were thus quickly placed into reserve and then sold for scrap in the early 1920s. With the exception of the Aurora, which was transferred to the Royal Canadian Navy, although dramatic budget cuts there meant that she spent most of the decade tied up and used for spare parts before she was also scrapped in 1927.
That's it for this video. Thanks for watching. If you have a comment or suggestion for a ship to review, let us know in the comments below. Don't forget to comment on the pinned post for dry dock questions.